Authority is a costume. A badge, a cruiser, a light bar. Out here in the deep woods, they're just props. Real authority identifies itself by radio, by dispatch number, and by protocol. If the authority sitting at your front door can't prove who sent them, you don't open it. You don't step onto the porch. You don't even let them see your silhouette in the window. I'm Evan, and these are the field logs of Lantern Bend. When Lauren and I first bought our cabin, it was just the two of us. Emma wasn't even a thought yet. I had recently walked away from the park ranger service, and my internal clock was still completely ruined from years of working night patrols. I couldn't sleep through the night. Usually, I'd just get out of bed so I wouldn't wake Lauren, make a pot of coffee, and sit at the desk in the main room. The cabin would be completely dark except for a single, low-wattage desk lamp. My primary entertainment back then wasn't television. It was a digital police scanner bank. I kept it locked to the county law enforcement frequency, running an ambient cycle in the background. It was a habit I couldn't break. If a real sheriff's deputy was operating anywhere near Lantern Bend, I heard the dispatch traffic. I heard the 10 codes. I always knew they were coming long before they turned down my road. Last Tuesday, at exactly 3 a.m., the scanner was dead silent. There was no radio traffic, no unit assignments. The entire county was asleep. But outside, I heard the slow, deliberate crunch of heavy tires rolling up our gravel access road. I didn't turn on the porch lights. I stood up, picked up my heavy revolver from the desk, and moved to the east window. Our driveway is a steep half-mile grade with 2 sharp switchbacks. Usually, you can hear a truck's transmission whine as it downshifts to make the climb. But whatever was coming up the hill wasn't shifting gears. It was just a steady, unrelenting hum. I pulled the heavy blackout curtain back exactly 6 inches, just enough to give me a line of sight down the driveway, but narrow enough to keep me hidden in the dark. Through the glass, I saw headlights sweeping through the pine trees. It was a single vehicle, moving at a steady, cautious speed. The speed of someone who had driven this road 100 times before. The vehicle crested the final hill and stopped right at the bottom of the grade, 20 feet from the edge of the yard. The engine idled, and the roof lit up. It was a county sheriff's cruiser. White paint over the county's standard charcoal lower panel. I could clearly see the star decal on the door and the heavy steel push bar bolted to the front bumper. At 120 feet away, bathed in the glow of its own light bar, the details were almost perfect. Almost. I watched the strobe pattern for 12 seconds before my brain registered the physical impossibility of what I was looking at. 12 seconds is a long time to stare at a police light bar. It's long enough for the solid-state electronic strobe module to cycle through its programmed sequence at least twice. A real county light bar repeats its exact pattern every 2.7 seconds. It is mechanical. It is flawless. This light bar didn't repeat. It pulsed. The intervals were shifting. The blue light held for a fraction of a second, then the red, then 2 quick flashes of blue, followed by a long, dark pause. The rhythm was asymmetrical. It was accelerating, then decelerating, the intervals lengthening and shortening in a wave. It took me another 5 seconds to recognize the cadence. Inhale, exhale. The pause between the flashes was exactly 1.3 seconds, the resting interval of a human heartbeat at 46 beats per minute. The light bar wasn't strobing. It was breathing. I heard a soft rustle of fabric behind me. Lauren had woken up. The red and blue pulses were bleeding aggressively through the edges of our bedroom curtains. She didn't turn on a hall light. She didn't call out my name. She just walked quietly into the living room, pulling her robe tight against the chill. She stepped up right behind me and looked out the gap in the curtains. Then, she looked down at the scanner bank sitting on the desk.
The scanner is empty.
Her voice was a tight, controlled whisper right next to my ear.
There's no dispatch signal? I'm gonna call the non-emergency line.
I kept my eyes locked on the cruiser outside while she picked up the corded landline on the desk. She dialed the local Lantern Bend dispatch number. She held the receiver to her ear for a few seconds, her brow furrowing in the dim light of the room. She pressed the speakerphone button so I could hear it. The line was ringing, but beneath the standard dialing tone, there was a heavy, rhythmic static. It was surging and fading in exact sync with the flashing red and blue lights outside our window. The entity wasn't just wearing the shape of a car. It was projecting a localized dampening field over our copper wiring. It was isolating us. Lauren gently set the receiver back down into the cradle, severing the connection.
Whoever is in that driveway, it's not a deputy.
I nodded. A real deputy pulling up to a dark residence at 3 a.m. follows a strict protocol. They hit the siren to announce their presence. They open the door, step out with a heavy boot on the gravel, and use the PA system to announce themselves. The vehicle at the edge of my yard did none of those things. It just sat there. The engine noise drifting up the hill was wrong too. A real county cruiser runs a heavy V8 Interceptor package. This engine was surging. It idled in a deep, guttural pulse, perfectly matching the heartbeat of the light bar. It sounded like a massive pair of lungs. Lauren's hand gripped the back of my shirt. We stood there in the dark, watching the breathing machine at the edge of the property. Then, the driver's side A-pillar spotlight clicked on. It was a blinding halogen beam, and it immediately began sweeping back and forth across the front of the cabin. It wasn't the jerky, manual movement of a human hand operating a swivel handle from inside a cab. It was perfectly smooth, mechanical. It swept across the porch logs, over the front door, and started tracking upward toward the living room windows. "Get down," I hissed. Lauren and I dropped to the hardwood floor just as the brilliant white beam slashed across the glass, flooding the ceiling of the cabin with harsh light. The beam lingered on our window for a terrifying 5 seconds, probing the gap in the curtains, looking for a silhouette, looking for proof that the bait was working. We stayed perfectly still on the floorboards. The pitch of the engine outside dropped into a low, vibrating growl that rattled the window panes. I checked my watch. It was 3:08. The standoff was just beginning. For the first few minutes, it just sat there, pulsing in the dark. But anomalies out here don't like to wait. They are predators. And when a predator realizes its camouflage isn't drawing the prey out, it escalates. A loud, sharp burst of electronic feedback echoed up the driveway. It sounded like a microphone being keyed on way too close to an amplifier. It was using the cruiser's PA system. The voice that boomed out of the grill speaker was deafening in the quiet woods. But it wasn't human. It sounded like a patchwork of different recordings, spliced together and flattened into a monotone drawl.
Resident, step outside.
The words were perfectly spaced, devoid of any natural inflection. I kept my head below the windowsill, gripping the pistol.
We have a report of an open door. Step into the light.
It was trying to manufacture a reason for me to leave the house. It was using basic law enforcement phrases it must have heard echoing off the mountain roads. But then, the mimicry took a turn. The PA system crackled again, and the voice changed. It wasn't flat anymore. It was pitched up, frantic.
Property owner, please. We have an officer down in the timber.
My blood ran cold. It was attacking my instincts. It didn't know exactly who was in the house, but it knew what first responders valued. It knew I used to wear a badge. If Lauren hadn't already checked the scanner, if I hadn't known with absolute certainty that there was no real dispatch traffic tonight, that PA announcement would have dragged me out onto the porch in a blind panic to help a wounded man. The voice over the loudspeaker glitched.
Come out with your hands empty. We have an officer empty.
It was looping, getting confused by its own bait. I didn't move a muscle. Lauren's hand tightened on my arm. And then, the voice changed one more time.
Evan, please open the door!
My breath caught. It was Lauren's voice. The inflection, the slight waver of fear, it was absolutely perfect. But Lauren was sitting right next to me on the hardwood floor, her eyes wide with terror as she listened to her own voice, begging to be let inside from the dark driveway. At 3:14, the PA system finally clicked off. The silence was a relief, but it only lasted for a few seconds. Because right behind me, the police scanner on my desk came alive. It didn't pick up county dispatch. The squelch broke, and the digital display lit up, locking onto a close-range, low-power frequency. The scanner was picking up a localized transmission. It was picking up the internal radio mic from inside the cruiser. I crawled backward away from the window, moving toward the desk to listen. There was no radio chatter. There were no voices. Through the static, I heard the sound of the cruiser's interior. It sounded wet. It sounded like a massive, heavy piece of raw meat being dragged across vinyl upholstery. There was a thick, rhythmic squelching noise, followed by a deep, wet exhalation that blew directly into the microphone. Whatever was sitting in the driver's seat, it wasn't wearing a uniform. It was something massive, biological, and it was taking up the entire cabin. As I listened to the wet breathing coming through my scanner, the engine outside suddenly roared. The low, guttural pulse spiked in pitch. I scrambled back to the window and looked out. The cruiser had shifted into gear. The tires crunched loudly against the gravel as it began to inch forward. 10 feet, 5 feet. It rolled forward until the heavy steel push bar on its front bumper was hovering directly over the edge of the gravel, inches from where the yard began. And it stopped. The light bar on the roof was no longer pulsing. It was thrashing. The red and blue lights were strobing violently, frantically, illuminating the pine trees in a chaotic, dizzying wave of color. The engine was surging so hard, the entire frame of the vehicle was vibrating. The scanner on my desk was screaming with static. The wet breathing inside the cab growing faster, shallower, like a runner preparing to sprint. It was testing the boundary. It knew I was inside. It knew I was watching. It was revving itself up, trying to decide if the edge of the yard was a physical barrier or just a suggestion. I raised the revolver, resting the heavy barrel on the wooden windowsill, aiming dead center at the driver's side windshield. I thumbed the hammer back. The metallic click was deafening in the dark room. If it pulled onto the grass, I wasn't going to wait to see what crawled out of the doors. I was going to unload the cylinder through the glass. The cruiser vibrated. The engine screamed. The lights strobed so fast they blurred into a solid purple glare. And then, the scanner went dead. The violent strobing of the light bar instantly dropped back to the slow, steady heartbeat. The engine settled back into its guttural, rhythmic idle. At exactly 3:17, the cruiser finally gave up. It didn't shift into reverse. The mechanical sound of a transmission engaging never happened. It simply began to glide backward down the steep grade. Slowly, deliberately. It moved backward with the exact same impossible smoothness that it had driven up. The headlights swept back through the trees, the breathing light bar deactivated, and the pulsing engine noise faded into the deep woods. Lauren and I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat at the window with the gun until the sun finally breached the tree line. As soon as there was enough daylight, I grabbed my coat, unlocked the deadbolt, and walked down the driveway. I needed physical proof. I needed to know exactly what had been sitting at the edge of my property. The gravel was deeply disturbed right where the vehicle had stopped. I crouched down and inspected the tire tracks. They were the correct width for a Crown Victoria wheelbase. They even had the correct tread pattern for the Goodyear Pursuit tires the county specifies for their fleet. The mimicry was incredibly detailed, but the physics were completely wrong. A real Crown Vic with a full interceptor package, a steel push bar, and an equipment trunk weighs over 4,000 pounds. It digs deep into the loose gravel on my road. These tracks were shallow, barely pressed into the top layer of the dirt. I measured the displacement. Whatever was sitting in my driveway weighed way less. It was hollow. A lightweight, biological shell shaped like a machine. I walked around to where the rear of the car had been idling. A normal vehicle sitting in one spot for 20 minutes leaves a patch of melted frost or warm dirt from the exhaust pipe. Sometimes there are black carbon deposits on the rocks. The gravel here wasn't warm, but it was wet. Dripping across the stones in a puddle roughly the size of a dinner plate was a thick, viscous, translucent fluid. It didn't smell like motor oil, and it didn't smell like unburnt gasoline. It smelled like stagnant pond water and ozone. The exhaust I had heard, the pulsing, guttural engine noise, had literally been the thing breathing out onto my driveway. I stood up and looked down the long, empty road leading into the timber. A cold sweat broke out across my back. The anomalies out here are learning. At the time, they were just mimicking roadkill, or imitating the sounds of crying animals to draw hikers off the trails. A month prior, I had found a detour sign deep in the woods that had learned how to perfectly mimic the Department of Transportation's reflective font. But this was an entirely new level of behavioral adaptation. The mimicry had escalated from infrastructure to authority. The predators in Lantern Bend realized that humans don't trust the woods anymore. So, they wear the costumes of the people we are legally required to trust. When I got back inside, Lauren was making coffee. The house felt normal again, but we both knew it wasn't. I opened my green logbook and wrote down a new set of survival protocols for the cabin. No one enters the property at night without radio verification. If a vehicle approaches, Lauren checks the scanner. If there is no dispatch signal, there is no deputy. If the light bar doesn't repeat on a fixed, mechanical cycle, it is not an electronic machine. And if nobody gets out of the car to identify themselves within 60 seconds, the vehicle is hostile. The door stays closed, the bolt stays engaged, and the costume stays outside the line. If you made it to the end of the field log, drop false sheriff in the comments so I know you checked the rhythm of the lights before opening the door. And tell me, if a cruiser pulled up to your house at 3 a.m. and the voice on the PA system sounded exactly like someone you loved, would you stay inside? Or would the mimicry get you to open the door? If you want to hear more case files, intercepted tapes, and field logs from Lantern Bend, hit subscribe, and turn on the bell. I've got a lot more to share. Stay safe out there. I'll see you next time.